Well folks, this is a startup video that I've been wanting to do for quite some time now. We're up behind the house, and this is the 1973 GMC 432 cubic inch V6 engine that we pulled out of a truck back in the beginning of 2019 that was parted out. And it hasn't been started since, and it was probably running a couple months prior to getting pulled out of the truck, but since I've owned it, I've never fired the thing up, and I've been wanting to, just haven't had the time to. So figured today is a really good day to get this thing cranked up and see how it runs. So there's a couple of things we have to do first, one of which is mount the radiator to this frame. I don't have a good way to get the welder here behind the house, and this thing's a pain in the neck to move around. So we're going to use some ratchet straps and 2x4s and see if we can get the radiator socked down to the front of this. We have to loop some of the oil cooler lines, figure out some of the electrical, and make sure we get spark and all that good stuff. First thing I am going to do is bring an air line up here from the garage and blow this thing off, because it's got all kinds of crap on it from the mice eating nuts and whatever else over the past few years that it's been covered up back here. So anyways folks, let's get to it. Engine is all blown off and cleaned up. So the next thing I have to do is take the power steering pump belt off, and along with the air compressor belt here. So I got to take this one and I got to take this one off. One, because I don't want the air compressor running, and two, because I don't want the power steering pump running without any fluid in it, or vacating what little fluid is left in it all over the place. I also have to take these two oil cooler lines off, and I'm going to loop this long one back into this one over here. I wanted to hook these up into the radiator, but the issue was that this line right here, as you can see, is broken up at the fitting right back here. I think it ended up breaking when we took this out of the truck, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm just going to loop this one back into it. I'd much rather just take these right off of the oil filter housing right here and plug them. The only issue is I don't know if with this oil system, if it has to have those lines in order to circulate oil through this engine, and I'd rather not take a gamble and find out the hard way. So we're just going to loop that long line, and that should take care of that. And it's hard to tell if it's actually ripped right through or not, but kind of hate to hook everything up and put it on there and have the thing just start pumping oil everywhere too. So this should be the same thread on this side. I can just, with any luck, loop this right back into itself. Just like so. That should do it. So this is what I came up for a radiator mount. With for a radiator mount. So I got two pieces of 2x6 here that I'm going to just C-clamp to these pieces of I-beam. And then I have the radiator cradle, which I'm going to put on top of this with the radiator in it, which will line me up with this bottom hose. The top hose really doesn't matter all that much. And then somehow or another I'm going to run some ratchet straps around it and see if I can suck it down to this piece of wood on the engine cradle. And the only other thing I'm going to have to do is brace the top of it from going this way like that, because if I rev this up, I don't want the fan sucking the radiator into it and then destroying that, because this radiator is not going to be a cheap one to fix or buy new if I ever have to. It's a rather good sized radiator. Something along the lines of that. That's what I was figuring. Which I can actually move these clamps in a little bit. At one point there was little feet on the bottom of this piece of metal with little rubber pads that kind of helped hold this radiator, but the little feet have since broken off, and I do have the rubber pads, but for what we're doing here, this should be just good enough. Alright, so one thing that I am going to do is get another piece of wood and raise this up, because you can see how close the fan is to the radiator, which I'd really like to avoid that if possible. So if I raise this up a little bit, it'll give me a little more clearance on the fan, because it'll get this elbow out a little bit further with the added height. So I'll get another board, prop that up, and then we can see about ratchet strapping this thing down a little bit. One more piece of wood seemed to get the radiator just where we need it. As you can see, we do have a little bit more clearance between the fan blades and the radiator. I have a couple ratchet straps running across the front of it, pulling it to either side, and it does seem to hold it fairly well. It does move a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be enough where the fan will suck the thing in, and it's not like I'm going to be running this thing wide open anyways. So that's all ready for fluid. I am going to use water in this for the test run. There is a little bit of antifreeze left in the water jacket on the engine, and I did check and make sure I can drain all this out afterwards, because there's plugs on either side right here at the bottom of the jacket. So that way I can get all the water out of the engine, and I'll probably dump in a little bit of antifreeze into the jacket again, just to be sure. So while this sits, nothing happens to it. But for the time being, we are going to run this off of water. So now that the radiator is all set, we are going to take a look at the electrical system and see if I can figure out which one in this harness is the trigger wire for the solenoid, or I could always use a jump wire down on the starter itself. And then of course we have to get the points cleaned up and make sure everything is all squared away with that. Electrical system is just about squared away. So I have a battery hooked up down here. I'm not doing anything special with the battery cable ends. I'm just doing vice grips to hold everything onto the battery. Really nice and light on the post just so I don't crush them. And then I have a jump wire that runs down from the hot stud on the solenoid up here to the coil. So that way all I have to do is just alligator clip that to the coil, and that's going to be my ignition. I also pull out the distributor cap and clean up the points. They're a little bit pitted, but they seem like they shined up just fine, so we should get a spark out of those. And the cap, the contacts underneath the cap actually look pretty darn good, so most likely this was serviced not long before it was taken out of service about 5 years ago. So the last things that I have to do here is, one, I have an oil line that stuck out the back of the engine here, which I believe this one went to the oil pressure gauge in the dash, and it had a line that ran off of there, right where that red cap is. So I have to get this fitting out of here and then put one of these pipe plugs in. And what I might actually do is hook up a oil pressure gauge to it too, so that way I can see if we're making pressure. So I have to do that. The carburetor does need to get tightened down a little bit, not so much where it bolts down to the manifold here, but where these screws run down through here, 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 and here, because this carburetor, as you can see where the screws are, everything kind of sandwiches together, and it is loose around this base gasket right here. So I don't know how well this is going to run, if it's going to be sucking a ton of air, but I'm going to sock those down the best I can and we'll find out. And then I also have to just run a hose off of our fuel pump right over here. Fuel pump is behind the alternator bracket, and that way I can run it down into a gas can. So I do have a longer piece of this 5/16 line, so I'll remove that and run that down into the can, and then we should be ready to fire up. So I'm going to get all that squared away, and then what I am going to do is just do a quick test fire on this thing to make sure we have spark, splash a little bit of gas down the carburetor and see if it'll light. And if it does, we can get the can hooked up, get some water in this radiator, and see if we can get this old V6 to crank back to life again. Alright, so we're going to give this a first initial test fire before we put any water in the radiator, just to make sure everything is going to fire up as it should. So I'm going to splash a little bit of gas down the carburetor. I have the solenoid trigger wire right here all stripped back so I can touch that to the battery. And I just want to see if it'll hit a few times. Alright, let's get some water into this thing, get that fuel can hooked up. Alright, here we go folks. I got the fuel tank hooked up, I got water in the radiator, so I'll probably have to crank this for a little bit to get all the fuel up into the carburetor, but let's give it a shot and see what happens. So what I am going to do is crack the fuel line loose and see if it's actually pumping up. Because I have no idea whether this fuel pump is good on here or not. Or whether the float's stuck in the carburetor for that matter too. It's still dry. I'll leave that off and crank it and see if I can shower myself in gas. So I have no idea whether the check valves or the diaphragm in this fuel pump are any good. It's pulling a little bit when I take the line off and put my finger over the end of it, but it's not drawn a lot. I think it's having trouble drawing from down below. So I'm going to see if I can prime it with a little bit of fuel. And maybe help it along to some degree. I don't know if it'll work or not. I think I got another V6 fuel pump on a 305 that I have in the driveway as a spare. In worst case, as long as it's the same as this one, I can go down and peel that one off and change it out if I have to. When I had that line off pouring it into here, it was running right out, which I know it's got a little bit of gravity and siphon going to it, but that sort of tells me that the check valves aren't shut all the way. And they're not closing real tight, so it might just have a problem pulling fuel. And unfortunately I do not have an electric fuel pump kicking around here either. At least I don't think I do. So try this one last time, see if it'll work. Let's see if I can get it to start without hitting the fan, holding it up here, and then I can stuff it in the can of fuel once it lights off. That's not good. folks, now I just gotta find a truck to put this thing in. It would make a heck of an engine swap putting it into the 64 when I get around to finishing that, once I get a place of my own, because that's got the 305 V6 in it. This 432 sure would juice it up, but I like to keep that one original. Someday I'd like to find another truck to put this into, maybe like a big truck like the 61 or something like that. I'd love to find a 3/4 ton 67 to 72 truck with one of these V6s in it from the factory. I don't have one of that body style yet. I always liked the ones that had the V6s in them. Be a nice addition to the fleet. But it's really great to hear this thing run after having it for almost 5 years now. One heck of an engine. Absolutely love the way these V6s sound. Well folks, it was nice to hear the 432 fire up. Been sitting around here long enough and figured today was a really great day to get the thing cranked up and see how everything sounds, and it looks like we got a nice engine to work with someday when I find another truck that I can stuff this in, or maybe one that I can even swap it out with. Like I said, I'd really like to find a pickup with one of these in it, aside from my 64, one of the 67 to 72 style, and maybe I'll even find a big truck that I can put this into someday, since it has that big old 5-speed spicer on the back of this thing. So either way, it looks like we got a good engine. It'll be a good spare. Doesn't smoke or anything like that. A little bit on startup, but cleared off once everything warmed up. So anyways folks, there you have it. That's the startup of the GMC 432 V6.